Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Well, it looks like Trump has found his next great black whale to go after. By all indications, the Orange Man is telegraphing that he intends to prosecute Ilhan Omar next, if he can manage it. Ilhan Omar introduced the Meals Act in Congress in 2020. This law reduced oversight on government-sponsored meal programs during the pandemic. This in turn led to the massive fraud that came from criminals in Minnesota who pocketed the money from those subsidies without ever rendering the services that the money was supposed to have been for. 2 years after this money had been embezzled, Ilhan Omar's husband, Tim Mynett, had set up a venture capital firm, Rose Lake Capital. Nothing strange there, except that this brand new venture capital firm went from having assets less than $1,000 in 2023 to now being worth anywhere between $6 and $30 million in only 1 year, which becomes more amazing when you consider that the business address for this multi-million-dollar venture capital firm is a WeWork in Washington, D.C., according to Mynett's LinkedIn page. A WeWork for a venture capital firm? Now, the upshot of all this is that Trump's DOJ wants to get their hands on Ilhan Omar and her husband's personal records so they can find out how these two became millionaires overnight, because there's serious questions about where the source of that funding came from. And apparently 2023 must have been a really great year for Tim Mynett in particular, because he also had a second business, a winery in California, that had also faced fraud allegations and was declared a failed business venture in 2023, but the very next year, this failed winery was suddenly worth between $1 and $5 million. There's also allegations that Omar's husband was associated with companies that owed some marijuana entrepreneurs $1.2 million in another failed deal. Well, I think it's safe to say whatever money is owed went up in smoke. When Ilhan Omar first came to Congress, she was all but broke. It's a story as old as Congress itself. Everyone knows that most of the people who come into the House of Representatives come in poor, and within a few years they're worth millions of dollars. Both parties do it, and it's not a new phenomenon at all. But fortunately, there's nothing suspicious going on in Omar's life, because around the time that Trump's DOJ announced charges against Somalians involved in that fraud scheme back in September and October, the names of at least 9 officers and advisors to Mynett's Rose Lake Capital firm were removed from the website, including some former Obama officials. Now, more than a few people have remarked about the fact that Omar's current husband is a white man. He's not even her first husband, but he is her current one. The question is, aren't the Somalians always the very first to tell everybody that nobody, absolutely nobody, is good enough for their culture? That their culture is so unique and has all of these superior traits, other groups just wouldn't fit in. Of course, these superior traits are not apparent at all if you look at Somalia, but when they get to the United States, you know, where the inferior black Americans actually built something and fought for our rights and theirs, incidentally, well, then all of a sudden their superior culture finally manifests itself here, but not there. Okay, now why did she choose to marry a white man in particular? Couldn't she find someone from her superior Somalian culture to marry? She did marry a Somalian once, but she claimed irreconcilable differences for their divorce. Well, how very lucky for her that Tim Mynett, the Democrats' political consultant, by the way, just so happened to be an eligible bachelor at the time, right? There's nothing untoward going on here, right? He loves her, she loves him, right? In fact, she loves her white husband so much, she didn't even bother to take his last name. Gee, reminds you of Kamala Harris, doesn't it? She married Douglas Emhoff, a white man, but she didn't take his last name either. I've been telling you for 18 years now, this is how these political animals move. They don't have marriages. They have arrangements. This is history repeating itself. Douglas Emhoff also had some questions about his finances, particularly his investments, and he too had to make some quick moves in order to try to bury that one. All the while, his woman of color spouse in the U.S. Congress was also telling everybody, nothing to see here. The reason this is important is because for the better part of a century before the lifting of the immigration restrictions in 1965 and in the decades before it, there have been African immigrants, including from Somalia, telling foundational black Americans that they work harder than we do, calling us lazy, saying that they're more industrious, have a superior culture, and that racism is basically not big a problem at all. And then we look at the actual financial situation and we see they themselves admit that they're at the bottom financially, at least in the state of Minnesota. Both of those things cannot be true. You can't be the most successful and the least at the exact same time, and of course it turns out that they're not both true. This is the problem with so many of these immigrants who come to the U.S. They're so busy trying to ingratiate themselves with the white powers that be, they start saying all kinds of things that just aren't true. They happen to come from countries that have a broken loyalty system. That's why these white supremacists can go ahead and just trample all over them. Places where lying, backstabbing, opportunism, disrespect, and double dealing are the norm. And that brings us to another subject closely related. On Christmas Day, no less, Trump decided to give the Nigerians a gift they weren't expecting, an airstrike. He claimed that ISIS was persecuting Christians there. That's doubly interesting, especially considering that during his first term, Trump claimed that he destroyed ISIS, that he defeated 100% of their forces. Well, I guess he must have missed a few. Now, believe it or not, this is not a new claim from Trump. In fact, back in October, he was threatening sanctions against Nigeria on the exact same grounds, claiming that he was worried about Christians being persecuted there, that they were being slaughtered, he said. He made that announcement on Halloween, by the way. So apparently this is his idea of ringing in the holidays. Obviously, this was about some other different objective. He's calling these places S-hole countries. His opinion hasn't changed, so he's not trying to actually help any Christians there. If they're black, he ain't trying to help them at all. You have people like Jason Johnson on MSNBC. Oh, I'm sorry, I mean MS Now. Jason Johnson, whose mother has worked for at least 2 different law enforcement agencies, and he said that Trump's strike on Nigeria was racially motivated. Well, he's going to have to convince the Nigerians of that first, because Nigeria's foreign ministry claims they gave the consent for the airstrikes.
Are you prepared, sir, to allow U.S. troops on the ground to use President Trump's words, guns a-blazing, when you say that you're prepared to accept help? Are you prepared for U.S. troops on the ground if that is, in fact, what the commander-in-chief supposes?
These are operational issues that would have to be considered by our military. I am heading foreign policy. I'm heading the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Diplomacy, and it's something that the Minister of Defense and some of our security agencies would be in a better position to respond to. But for now, we have collaborated on this attack. It was a collaborative effort between Nigeria and the U.S., and President Tinubu gave the go-ahead before it took place, and we don't see it violating our sovereignty or territorial integrity, which is very important. And it is not about religion, it's about the protection of lives and property of Nigerians and our neighbors as well.
Let's be honest, can a failed state whose citizens are fleeing, or Japa as the Nigerian word for it is, and is helplessly reliant on U.S. foreign aid, really afford to say no to whatever D.C. wants, including airstrikes? Nigeria does have oil, not that its people have benefited one iota from it, but the U.S. already controls it, at least U.S. multinational corporations do. The Nigerian government allows that too, and they don't care a whit about the Nigerian people. And on a side note, Trump called the attacks on Christians in Nigeria genocide. He also said that the non-existent mistreatment of white Dutch occupiers in South Africa is also genocide. Meanwhile, when talking about the Palestinians, he says Israel is defending itself. See, if ISIS had given Trump enough money, he would have overlooked their misdeeds too. Now, the point for making this the subject of this morning's briefing is that we as foundational Black Americans are told all the time that we need to emulate the successful practices of immigrant groups. In fact, it's the ones from Africa in particular who are the first to wag their fingers at us and tell us they're more successful than we are, and that's why they avoid having anything to do with us. We come from a culture that doesn't produce success. And they've had right-wing shills like Thomas Sowell saying that, and if that incompetent buffoon says it, then it must be true, right? Well, for the very first time, you've got someone, a right-wing government, by the way, I guess that's why Thomas Sowell isn't saying anything about it, who's actually fact-checking these claims and drilling down on verifying where these groups' alleged success was coming from all these years. And now everyone's getting shut up, including Thomas Sowell. And I don't think it's a coincidence at all that this began during Biden's term. Get it how you live, I suppose. But people need to understand all the talking down that was done toward us and all the phony tough talk that we have from immigrants talking about how the U.S. better not mess with them or else they come from a culture of fighters, etc. All of that phony rhetoric is being put to the test. Trump calls Somalians garbage, and Somalia's president says that he prefers not to talk about it. Nigeria's response has been even worse. They've said they consented to the attack on their soil. So next time Trump decides to drop some more bombs on their heads, it will be little more than a misunderstanding at worst. And what does it say that the most populous country in Africa needs a foreign nation to handle their own internal security threats because they can't? And I don't know whether it's too early to start the over-under on whether Omar is going to go to prison, but as for charges, I think those are inevitable. If Trump was willing to go after Letitia James multiple times for less, then going after a Democratic congresswoman, especially one who AIPAC tried to unseat but failed, well, that seems a lot more feasible. And Ilhan Omar is going to look pretty strange if she tries to claim that Trump bringing charges against her is racially motivated. Funny how the same immigrants from Africa who spent decades mocking foundational black Americans and declaring that they don't know anything about our experience with racism or slavery because, well, in their home countries, everyone's black, so race doesn't really matter. And besides, all the stuff that happened to us, that was in the U.S. None of that happened in their home countries, so they can't really relate whenever we talk about racism or slavery or Jim Crow or targeted discrimination. They can't really relate to that because they have no experience with it. Well, now they seem to have suddenly figured out exactly what these things are, but only because the orange man has his foot up their behinds. Poor Ilhan Omar, she thought she did everything right. She avoided having anything to do with foundational black American interests. Hell, she wouldn't even do anything when a fellow Somalian, Officer Mohammed Noor, was prosecuted for killing a white woman. And she married someone from the dominant society. She probably thought that that would protect her, but it didn't because it never does. These other groups who have been making excuses for the mistreatment of FBAs and saying racism doesn't exist, they opened the door to all of this. When white power lets some of these tools get their hands on a little bit of money, they don't do it without knowing exactly how they're going to claw that money back when the time comes. And the time always comes. And the immigrants are not going to be able to bail themselves out of this one, certainly not on their own. The reason that they failed to come up with any sort of cross-cultural alliance to defend themselves from these political onslaughts is because all of them practice cultural and social isolation. It becomes every immigrant group for themselves. Opportunists don't really do cooperation that well. The off-code immigrants and tethers no doubt are going to wonder, why is it that the black media just keeps coming back to this theme over and over again? They already know, they just wish that we would stop. We keep coming back to this because nothing happens in a vacuum under white supremacy. When you make excuses for white supremacy's barbarity and evil against black Americans, what you've done is you've created a debt, and when that bill comes due, it's going to be hell to pay. And the very same forces of evil that they covered for and made excuses for inevitably have turned their guns on them. They didn't have these white supremacists fooled, not for an instant. Not when it came to where all that federal loot disappeared to, not when it came to their claims that racism didn't exist, and certainly not when it came to their boasting about their political clout. These white supremacists were not fooled at all. That's why they're not hesitating to go in on them. They know what the reality is. Because they weren't playing any games. All these immigrant groups, they are always willfully confused about whether or not white supremacy has it in for them. They think to themselves, hey, back in our home country, what you do is you go ahead and find some group that you think nobody's going to stick up for. You make them the designated whipping boy, and they just basically catch hell, while others are allowed to go on about their lives. Well, they didn't seem to realize that under white supremacy, they are also lumped in with the undesirables. And what's happening is the black media is reminding people of what actually occurred. That way nobody tries to rewrite the record. The people who embolden white supremacy now have to deal with its fangs. And clearly, they didn't have a plan for that. But hey, in the unlikely event that Trump decides to bring charges against Omar, well, she shouldn't worry about having bail. All she has to do is ask her husband. I hear he's good for the money. Though I think I should be the first to go on the record right now to say that in the event that Omar does wind up getting indicted, don't be surprised if her husband suddenly decides to turn state's evidence against her or make some sort of deal. Because at the end of the day, he knows that he's not the prime target, she is. She's the one that they actually want. And besides, she didn't take his last name, so how close could they possibly be? And if her husband actually did decide to do her like that, well, it wouldn't be that big a surprise. After all, he's had so many other failed ventures. Why not his marriage, too? Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Ginger Vine, Reasonable Dude, Barbara Bonsu, LaDane Hayden, and Alfredo Roberts. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.